Several 2020 Democratic presidential candidates have called for increasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court. Earlier this month, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg laid out his own proposal. It calls for 15 judges on the Supreme Court, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 5 apolitical judges. Under the plan, most of the justices would continue to serve life terms. While many organizations are in favor of packing the courts, some advocates say that Buttigieg's proposal is flawed. Here to explain is the campaign manager of Take Back the Court, Kate Kendell. Kate, thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Kate, lay out for us why you're so passionate about this issue, because I have watched it go from a fringe Twitter movement to the mouths of several of the major presidential candidates.
We are talking about a very mainstream idea now, this idea of expanding the size of the court. And the reason is pretty simple. Democracy is on life support between McConnell's dirty tricks, stealing a seat from President Obama, an illegitimate confirmation in our view of Brett Kavanaugh, and the Roberts majority eviscerating voting rights, very likely to allow gerrymandering. We no longer live, or on the verge of no longer living in a representative democracy. And we will be ruled by folks in power who are there illegitimately and who can't win popular elections unless they cheat. So we must reform the structure of the court if we are to literally save democracy and the values that we have taken for granted for a very long time that are now under serious threat.
So, Kate, in your view, can you be a serious Democratic contender if you're not willing to consider some form of court packing?
You cannot be a serious Democratic contender if you do not talk about at least court reform. We think court expansion is the right option. But I saw Mayor Pete at an event here in San Francisco a few weeks ago. And what I said to him is, look, court expansion, we think, is the fastest, easiest, least challengeable way to reform the court. But at a minimum, please keep talking about how important structural reform of the court is, because I don't care how great your ideas are, how detailed your plans are. If you don't have a plan for court reform, every one of those is dead in the water and are going to go nowhere. So you can't be taken seriously if you don't talk about court reform.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kate, the counter obviously is that this is disrupting the last semi-apolitical institution in the United States, that turning this, it only will turn. If you thought the Kavanaugh confirmation was bad, imagine the Senate battle over packing the court. It could cleave the country in half, lead to whatever civil disruption. Is that just the cost of doing business and of gaining more power?
Well, I want to take issue with the very first assumption there,
mm-hmm.
that you're taking an institution that is relatively apolitical. That is no longer true.
Mm-hmm.
When I decided to become a lawyer as a young person, because the court was always a little bit political, but really tried to hew to the center and to values that we all shared. The Berger Court was the court I came to consciousness with. Even the Rehnquist Court really still valued voting rights and understood that voter suppression was anathema to what we stood for as a country. The Roberts Court is the most ideologically riven that we have seen in generations. So they are thoroughly partisan, thoroughly in the back pocket of corporate interests and the billionaire class, allowing this flow of dark money. So we have to understand the reality we now live in and not pretend that there's some halcyon moment where the court still can yet be saved with legitimacy. This is an illegitimate court, and we need to respond in kind by saying we need to do something that is bold to reform the court and try to save our democracy.
Well, Kate, we can look to history for some of this. The Roosevelt effort to pack the court effectively ended the glory days of the 100 days. It nuked much of his domestic agenda for the rest of the period and actually solidified institutional support for the court up until this political moment. Do you worry that your effort might do the same? If anything, it could harden the institutional awareness around the court to keep 9 seats, because that was really the downfall of the Roosevelt court packing moment in the 1930s.
Well, 2 responses. The first is that the truism, I guess, the stitch in time that saved 9. There is, a fair amount of data and writing that supports that what the thread of adding justices to the court did under Roosevelt is it moderated the Chief Justice to save many parts of the New Deal. But that's a different effort than what we're about here. We don't want to expand the court for any particular issue or set of legislative agenda items. We want to add justices to the court to literally restore democracy. So that's one response. And the second response is something you alluded to a little bit earlier, which is the option of sitting on our hands or hand wringing and hoping that democracy will save itself, that is a feckless enterprise that makes us complicit in the demise of democracy. We have to do something bold and remarkable in this very ahistorical moment where we are under a serious threat.
Well, it's an urgency of action that I see on the right and in the left, and it's really just a fed up attitude with the establishment politics here in Washington. I do want to ask you, which candidates, in your view, have taken the best approach to reforming the Supreme Court?
Well, so far there are 9 of the declared Democratic candidates who have at least expressed support for court reform. Kamala Harris has actually said that she would put on the table the idea of expanding the size of the court. Buttigieg has talked most about court reform of all the candidates, but Beto O'Rourke has mentioned court reform. Elizabeth Warren has mentioned court reform. There are a couple of candidates. Cory Booker has talked about court reform, but he has explicitly rejected the idea of expanding the court. Bernie Sanders isn't even talking about court reform, along with several of the other candidates. But you can't be taken seriously if you're at least not talking about court reform. And we can say for another day, but all of the candidates need to understand that, Buttigieg's 555 plan, that would go to this very court for this court to determine that plan's legitimacy, and it would be struck down. The only way this is going to succeed, is saving democracy, is to expand the court, which can be done by a bill in Congress. It's not challengeable, and there we go. And then we can go about rebuilding the democracy that we love.
Well, so the specifics of Buttigieg's plan, do you think that would actually restore faith in the Supreme Court with the majority of the American public?
Well, if the plan could survive, and that's the big if. I don't believe it could. It would be challenged, and I do not believe this court would uphold it. But if it could survive, it's worth having that conversation. I'm still in the place, even though we are 100% throwing down with we need to expand the size of the court. The moderate and left and independents need to have the same sort of passion around the court that we've seen on the hard right. Many people found Donald Trump odious as a candidate. They voted for him anyway, precisely because they knew he would put hardcore conservatives on the court, and he did. So even if we only improve the passion and understanding and depth of knowledge about how important the court is on the moderate left independent side, we will have accomplished a great deal. And Buttigieg talking about any plan helps with that, and any candidate talking about court reform helps with that.
So, Kate, the presumptive or the leading Democratic contender, Vice President Joe Biden, I don't think he's addressed court reform, but given his general embrace of the politics of yesterday, he's not likely to embrace something like this. Would you be able to support him if he doesn't come out for court reform?
Well, it's early days yet, and we plan on making many incursions to the Biden campaign to educate him about how important it is for him to understand the current threat and to not act as if it's 20 or 30 years ago and we aren't facing an ideologically driven and partisan court. So that's one answer. The second thing is, whoever the Democratic nominee is should be supported by anyone who loves this country and wants to save democracy. We can live to fight another day if a candidate is elected that hasn't put on his or her agenda court reform. I do think that is a position that lacks integrity, because you're not going to get your positions through with this court. But we're in such a dangerous moment in this country to at least have someone in the White House who understands the Constitution, understands the balance of power, that can exercise and moderate their power consistent with ideals and values that we love and care about as Americans. That person would have my vote.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Kate. I really appreciate it. Very interesting topic.
I appreciate this so much. I love the conversation anytime.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.